The courtroom falls silent as the judge's gavel strikes the wooden block. 66-year-old Daniel Rigg, decorated Marine sniper, sits in handcuffs while the jury deliberates his fate for charges that should never have been filed. Outside, protesters chant for justice, their voices echoing through the concrete halls. What they don't know is that in 12 minutes, a military helicopter will land on the courthouse steps carrying General Samuel Wyatt, the one man who can save him and reveal the truth that's been buried for 50 years. But will he arrive in time to prevent the greatest injustice of Rigg's life? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and redemption, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe that true heroes deserve recognition regardless of their race, please hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode reveals shocking government secrets you definitely don't want to miss. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Rigg sat alone in Murphy's Diner on East Washington Street in downtown Indianapolis. The 66-year-old Marine veteran maintained his military posture even in the worn vinyl booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Silver threads ran through his closely cropped beard, and despite the early morning hour of 6 a.m., he was already dressed in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt. His faded Marine Corps cap sat on the table beside a folded copy of the Indianapolis Star. The diner was nearly empty, except for a few construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts. Daniel preferred these quiet morning hours, a routine he'd maintained for 15 years, since retiring from his job as a community college history instructor. The Purple Heart medal pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent light as he turned the newspaper pages, reading about local politics and community events with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to scanning enemy territory through a rifle scope. At 6:15 a.m., the bell above the diner door chimed as 3 white teenagers stumbled in, their clothes reeking of alcohol and marijuana from what was obviously an all-night party. Tyler Morrison, a 19-year-old college dropout with bleached hair and expensive sneakers, led the group to a booth near Daniel's table. His companions, Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins, both 18 and clearly from wealthy families based on their designer clothes, followed with the swagger of young men who'd never faced real consequences. "Look at this old black dude taking up space," Tyler announced loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably been sitting here all night nursing 1 cup of coffee like they always do." Daniel looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm but alert. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Maria Rodriguez, the waitress who'd served Daniel for years, shot an apologetic look from behind the counter, but continued wiping down glasses with nervous energy. "Man, I bet he's one of those welfare cases," Jake added, sliding into the booth. "My dad says they just hang out in places like this because they got nowhere else to go." Daniel folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside. "Gentlemen," he said in a quiet, measured voice that carried decades of military authority, "I'm not looking for any trouble. Perhaps you could keep your voices down so everyone can enjoy their breakfast." The request was polite, reasonable, and delivered with the kind of respect Daniel had learned in the Marines. But Tyler's face flushed red with anger, and something else Daniel recognized from his years in combat zones, the kind of privileged rage that comes from being challenged by someone you consider beneath you. "Did this old man just tell us what to do?" Tyler stood up, his voice rising to attract attention from everyone in the diner. "Did this threatening old black guy just try to intimidate us?" Daniel remained seated, his hands visible on the table, making no aggressive moves whatsoever. "I simply asked you to lower your voices, nothing more." "He's threatening us!" Brett jumped up, pulling out his phone to start recording. "This crazy veteran is threatening innocent people." "Someone call the police." Maria stepped forward from behind the counter. "That's not what happened. Mr. Rigg was just asking them to be quiet. He didn't threaten anyone." But Tyler was already on his phone with 911, his voice taking on a panicked tone that would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. "Help! There's a dangerous black man at Murphy's Diner threatening to hurt us. He looks like he might have weapons. Please hurry." Daniel felt a familiar chill run down his spine, the same sensation he'd experienced in Vietnam when he realized he was walking into an ambush. He'd survived 3 tours of duty, earned a Silver Star and Purple Heart, and taught thousands of students about American history and values. But in this moment, in a diner where he'd been a regular customer for over a decade, he knew he was facing a different kind of warfare. Within 4 minutes, 3 police cruisers arrived with sirens blaring. Officers Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh burst through the door with their hands on their weapons, immediately scanning the room for threats. Their eyes locked onto Daniel, the only black person in the establishment, and their body language shifted into aggressive mode. "That's him!" Tyler pointed dramatically at Daniel, who remained seated with his hands visible. "He threatened to hurt us, said he knew ways to make people disappear." Daniel had said no such thing, but the officers didn't bother to ask for his side of the story. Officer Patterson, a 15-year veteran with a documented history of complaints from minority communities, approached Daniel's table with his hand resting on his service weapon. "Stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back," Patterson commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding," Daniel began, rising slowly from his seat. "I simply asked these young men to lower their voices. I made no threats of any kind." "Save it for the judge," Patterson snapped, roughly grabbing Daniel's arms and forcing them behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with unnecessary force, pinching the skin on Daniel's wrists. "You're under arrest for terroristic threatening and disturbing the peace." Maria tried to intervene again. "Officers, I saw everything. Mr. Rigg didn't threaten anyone. These boys were drunk and causing trouble. He was just trying to eat his breakfast in peace." Officer Walsh turned on the waitress with a dismissive wave. "Ma'am, we need you to step back and let us do our job. We have multiple witnesses saying this man made threats." The multiple witnesses were the 3 teenagers who had fabricated the entire incident, but their word carried more weight than the truth. Daniel's Purple Heart medal, visible on his jacket, might as well have been invisible to the officers, who saw only a black man accused by white victims. As they led Daniel toward the police car, his Marine Corps cap fell to the floor of the diner, landing beside the newspaper he'd been reading peacefully just minutes before. The headline visible on the open page read, "Local Veterans Honored for Service," a bitter irony that wasn't lost on the man now being treated like a common criminal. The ride to the Marion County Jail took 12 minutes, during which officers Patterson and Walsh discussed Daniel as if he weren't sitting in the back seat. They speculated about his criminal history and wondered aloud whether he might be one of those unstable veterans they'd been warned about in training. Daniel said nothing, knowing from experience that silence was often the wisest course when facing overwhelming force. At the jail, Daniel was processed like any other suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph snapped for the mugshot that would later appear on evening news broadcasts across Indianapolis. His personal effects were catalogued and stored: wallet containing $43, house keys, and a worn photograph of his late wife Sarah and their daughter Michelle. His Purple Heart medal was noted as decorative pin on the property sheet. The charges were filed within 2 hours: terroristic threatening in the 2nd degree and disturbing the peace. Bail was set at $50,000, an amount that would require Daniel to put up his house as collateral. For a man living on a modest military pension and Social Security, it might as well have been $50 million. By evening, the story had reached local news stations. Channel 8 led with "Veteran Threatens Teens at Downtown Diner," showing Daniel's mugshot alongside smiling school photos of Tyler, Jake, and Brett. The narrative was set before Daniel even had a chance to speak with a lawyer. Dangerous Black. Veteran terrorizes innocent white college students. The fact that the victims were drunk, disorderly, and had fabricated the entire incident was lost in the rush to broadcast breaking news. Daniel spent his first night in county jail in a cell, with 2 other men awaiting trial. As he lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but think about the country he'd served for 4 years in Vietnam, the students he'd taught about justice and equality, and the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. Somewhere, in the darkness, he wondered if the America he'd fought for had ever really existed, or if it had always been a dream deferred for people who looked like him. The Marion County Superior Court had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the prosecution of Daniel Rigg brought out a level of media attention that surprised even veteran court observers. By the time Daniel's arraignment took place, 3 days after his arrest, protesters had gathered on both sides of the courthouse steps, creating a volatile atmosphere that required additional security. Daniel's court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh, not to be confused with the arresting officer, was a recent law school graduate working her first year in the public defender's office. With a caseload of over 100 active cases, she had approximately 40 minutes to review Daniel's file before their first meeting in the concrete interview room at the county jail. "Mr. Rigg, I've looked over the charges against you," she began, flipping through pages that contained more gaps than actual investigation. "The state has 3 witnesses who say you threatened them with violence. That's going to be difficult to overcome." Daniel sat across from her in his orange jumpsuit, maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. "Ms. Walsh, I never threatened those young men. I asked them politely to lower their voices, that's all that happened." "I understand that's your version of events," she replied, already sounding defeated. "But we have to be realistic about what we're facing here. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle is prosecuting this case personally, which means she sees it as a high-priority conviction." What Daniel didn't know was that Rebecca Carlisle was running for mayor on a tough-on-crime platform, and his case had become a centerpiece of her campaign strategy. Local polls showed her trailing her opponent by 8 points, but a high-profile conviction of a dangerous veteran could shift public opinion in her favor. The preliminary hearing took place in Judge Robert Morrison's courtroom, a wood-paneled chamber that had hosted Indianapolis justice for over 60 years. Judge Morrison, a white man in his early 70s, had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom, but his efficiency often came at the expense of thorough examination of evidence. Jury selection proved to be the first major obstacle for Daniel's defense. The jury pool was drawn from Marion County voter rolls, which skewed heavily toward suburban areas with predominantly white populations. Potential jurors were asked basic questions about their ability to be impartial, but deeper questions about racial bias were deemed irrelevant by Judge Morrison. The final jury consisted of 10 white jurors, 1 Hispanic woman, and 1 black man who worked as a security guard. During voir dire, several potential jurors had openly expressed skepticism about veterans, particularly those who had served in Vietnam. "Those guys came back messed up," one dismissed juror had said. "You never know what might set them off." Media coverage of the jury selection process focused heavily on Daniel's military background, but not in the way that might have helped his case. Channel 8's legal analyst, former prosecutor David Kelly, appeared on the evening news to discuss the unique challenges of prosecuting veterans. "Veterans with combat experience can be unpredictable," Kelly explained to viewers. "They're trained killers who've seen violence most of us can't imagine. When they feel threatened or cornered, that training can kick in with dangerous results." The fact that Daniel had served his country with honor, earned decorations for bravery, and spent 30 years teaching American history to community college students was mentioned only in passing. The narrative had already been established. Dangerous veteran threatens innocent civilians. 3 days before the trial began, Daniel's daughter Michelle drove down from Chicago, where she worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She'd taken unpaid leave to attend her father's trial, despite the financial hardship it represented for her family. "Dad, I've found a private attorney who might take the case," she told him during visiting hours at the county jail. "Gerald Watson has experience with discrimination cases. He thinks we might have grounds for a civil rights lawsuit after this is over." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Michelle, honey, I can't ask you to spend money you don't have. Mr. Watson probably charges more in an hour than I get in Social Security all month." "This isn't about money, Dad. This is about justice. You served this country for 4 years. You taught students about the Constitution and civil rights for 3 decades. You don't deserve this. But justice, as Daniel was learning, was often a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Private attorneys required retainers that started at $25,000, money that neither Daniel nor his daughter possessed. The media circus intensified as the trial date approached. Local news stations ran nightly segments about the case, almost always leading with Daniel's mugshot and referring to him as the accused veteran. Tyler Morrison's family hired a public relations firm to handle media requests, ensuring that their son was portrayed as a victim of veteran violence rather than a privileged teenager who had fabricated criminal charges. One particularly damaging piece aired on Channel 13's evening newscast 3 days before trial. The segment, titled "When Veterans Attack," featured interviews with psychiatrists who had never met Daniel but were willing to speculate about the underlying trauma that might drive a veteran to threaten civilians. Vietnam veterans in particular carry psychological scars that may not manifest for decades, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in PTSD. A seemingly minor confrontation can trigger flashbacks to combat situations, causing these individuals to perceive threats where none exist. The segment showed stock footage of Vietnam War combat while discussing Daniel's case, creating a visual association between his situation and wartime violence. No mention was made of Daniel's peaceful 30-year career as an educator, his volunteer work with literacy programs, or his spotless criminal record. Meanwhile, the three accusers were portrayed as innocent victims whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter with Daniel. Tyler Morrison appeared on multiple talk shows, describing his terror at being threatened by a trained killer who looked like he could snap at any moment. The courthouse itself became a daily gathering point for protesters representing both sides of the case. Military veterans who had heard about Daniel's situation drove from across the Midwest to show support, standing in silent formation wearing their service uniforms and holding signs reading "Honor Our Veterans" and "Justice for Daniel Rigg." On the opposite side of the courthouse steps, members of various community groups carried signs demanding "safety from violent veterans" and "protect our children." The two groups maintained an uneasy distance, separated by police barriers and watched closely by officers who feared the situation might explode into violence. Local politicians quickly chose sides based on their electoral calculations. Mayor James Harrison, a Democrat facing re-election, issued a statement calling for calm and respect for the judicial process. His Republican challenger, Susan Martinez, held a press conference demanding maximum penalties for anyone who threatens our young people. The stage was set for a trial that had less to do with determining Daniel Rigg's guilt or innocence than with satisfying the political and social agendas of people who saw his case as a symbol of larger cultural battles. In this circus atmosphere, the truth of what had happened in Murphy's diner on that quiet morning seemed almost irrelevant. As Daniel prepared for trial in his county jail cell, reading legal documents by the fluorescent light that never dimmed, he found himself thinking about the young Marines he'd served with in Vietnam. Many of them hadn't made it home. Those who had returned often faced a hostile reception from a country that seemed ashamed of the war they'd been ordered to fight. Now, 50 years later, Daniel was discovering that his service still carried no weight when measured against the accusations of three privileged teenagers who had never sacrificed anything for their country. The Purple Heart Medal that had meant so much to him was sitting in a property envelope, reduced to evidence in a case that threatened to destroy the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle strode into the Marion County Superior Courtroom wearing a navy blue suit that conveyed both authority and sympathy, a calculated choice designed to appeal to the jury she would spend the next week trying to convince. Her opening statement lasted 42 minutes and painted Daniel Rigg not as a decorated veteran, but as a dangerous predator who had used his military training to terrorize innocent young men. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Carlisle began, making eye contact with each juror in turn, "we are here today because the defendant, Daniel Rigg, a man trained in violence and killing, chose to threaten three young men whose only crime was enjoying a meal at a local restaurant." She gestured toward Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins, who sat in the front row dressed in conservative suits and ties, their parents flanking them like protective shields. "These three young men will tell you about the fear they experienced when this defendant, a trained sniper with decades of weapons experience, made it clear that he could hurt them in ways they couldn't imagine." Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh started to object to the characterization, but Judge Morrison waved her down before she could speak. "The prosecutor will confine her statements to evidence that will be presented," he said mildly, a warning that carried no real teeth. Carlyle's strategy became clear as she called her first witness. Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist from Indiana University who specialized in what he termed late-onset veteran violence. Dr. Webb had never met Daniel, never reviewed his military records, and had no direct knowledge of the case, but his credentials impressed the jury. "Dr. Webb, in your professional opinion, are older veterans more likely to engage in threatening behavior than the general population?" Carlyle asked. "Absolutely," Webb replied without hesitation. "Veterans, particularly those who served in combat zones like Vietnam, carry what we call trained lethality. Unlike civilian criminals who might threaten violence they can't actually carry out, these individuals possess the skills and psychological conditioning to follow through on their threats." Jennifer Walsh rose to object. "Your Honor, this witness has no knowledge of my client's specific case or psychological state." "Sustained," Judge Morrison ruled, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard an expert witness essentially declare that veterans like Daniel were inherently more dangerous than other people. The prosecution's case built systematically over 3 days, each witness adding another layer to the narrative of Daniel as a threatening figure. Tyler Morrison took the stand first, his testimony polished through hours of preparation with Carlyle's team. "He looked at us with these cold, calculating eyes," Tyler said, dabbing at tears that appeared on cue. "It was like he was deciding the best way to hurt us. Then he said, and I'll never forget these words, 'Young men like you need to learn respect, and I know ways to teach it that you'll never forget.'" Daniel had never said anything remotely similar, but Tyler delivered the fabricated quote with such conviction that 2 jurors visibly recoiled. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins followed with supporting testimony that corroborated Tyler's lies, their stories rehearsed to eliminate the contradictions that had appeared in their initial police statements. The defendant kept talking about his military training, Jake testified. He said he'd been in situations where he had to make people disappear, and that local police couldn't protect us if he decided we needed to be taught a lesson. Again, pure fabrication, but delivered with the earnestness of youth supposedly traumatized by encounter with violence. Brett Collins added the final touches to their fictional narrative. "When Mr. Riggs stood up, I could see he was evaluating us. Like targets," Brett said. He mentioned that he still had connections in the military, people who knew how to handle problems quietly. "We were terrified." Carlyle reinforced these testimonies by calling Officer Michael Patterson to the stand. Patterson, the arresting officer, embellished his police report significantly during his testimony. "When we arrived at the diner, the defendant was agitated and belligerent," Patterson testified. "He kept mentioning his military service and making veiled references to his combat experience. We had to restrain him because he appeared ready to escalate the situation." Jennifer Walsh knew this was false. Daniel had been completely cooperative during his arrest, but she lacked the resources to investigate Patterson's history of misconduct or challenge his testimony effectively. The prosecution's masterstroke came when Carlyle called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a psychiatrist, who had never treated Daniel but claimed expertise in veteran-related violence. Dr. Hendricks testified that Vietnam veterans often experienced delayed onset aggressive episodes, triggered by perceived disrespect from younger generations. The defendant's military service, particularly as a sniper, would have conditioned him to respond to threats with calculated violence, Dr. Hendricks explained. When these young men inadvertently triggered his psychological conditioning, he reverted to his military training and began assessing them as potential targets for elimination. The testimony was devastating because it sounded scientific and authoritative, even though it was based on no examination of Daniel and contradicted by decades of research showing that veterans were not more violent than the general population. But the jury heard a doctor with impressive credentials declaring that Daniel's military service made him inherently dangerous. Carlyle's closing argument tied together all these threads into a narrative of inevitable violence, narrowly averted. The defendant is a trained killer who saw 3 young men enjoying themselves and decided they needed to be taught a lesson through intimidation and fear, she told the jury. If not for the quick action of these brave young men in calling police, We might be here today discussing assault or worse. She paused dramatically, looking at each juror. Daniel Rigg may have served his country decades ago, but that service does not give him the right to terrorize civilians today. Your verdict must send a clear message that this community will not tolerate veterans who use their training to threaten innocent people. Throughout the prosecution's case, Daniel sat at the defense table maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through combat, imprisonment, and now trial. He watched as his military service, the thing he was most proud of in his life, was twisted into evidence of his supposed dangerousness. The Purple Heart he'd earned saving his squad from enemy fire was portrayed as proof that he was capable of violence. The Silver Star citation gathering dust in his closet told a story of heroism, but the jury would never hear it. The most painful moment came when Carlisle displayed Daniel's military ID photograph from Vietnam on the courtroom's large screen. "Look at this image," she told the jury. "This is a young man trained to kill efficiently and without remorse. That training doesn't disappear with age. It lies dormant, waiting for the right trigger." The photograph showed 19-year-old Daniel in his Marine dress uniform, proud and hopeful, ready to serve his country with honor. 50 years later, that same image was being used to convince a jury that he was a threat to society. As the prosecution rested its case, Daniel felt a familiar sensation from his Vietnam days, the knowledge that he was surrounded by enemy forces, with no clear path to safety. But this time, there would be no helicopter extraction, no supporting fire from friendly forces. This time, he was truly alone. Comment number 1 if you believe that a veteran's service record should be considered during trial, or comment number 2 if you think past military service is irrelevant to criminal charges. Don't forget to hit that like button if you support fair treatment for all veterans, and make sure to subscribe, because you won't believe what happens when the truth finally comes to light. Will Daniel's defense be able to counter the prosecution's character assassination? Can 3 decades of honorable civilian life outweigh fabricated testimony from privileged accusers? The next part of this story will shock you with revelations that change everything. Jennifer Walsh's defense of Daniel Rigg began with the kind of systematic disadvantages that plague public defenders across America. Too many cases, too little time, and resources stretched so thin they might as well be non-existent. As she stood to present her opening statement, Walsh carried a briefcase containing exactly 37 pages of notes about Daniel's case, compared to the prosecution's 3 boxes of prepared materials. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh began, her voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized Carlisle's presentation. "My client, Daniel Rigg, is not the dangerous predator the prosecution wants you to believe. He's a 66-year-old retired teacher who simply asked some disruptive teenagers to lower their voices." It was a weak opening, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Walsh hadn't been able to investigate the backgrounds of the 3 accusers, hadn't uncovered their history of minor legal troubles, and most critically, hadn't been granted access to Daniel's military service records that might have shown the jury the kind of man he really was. The first major blow came when Judge Morrison ruled that Daniel's military records were irrelevant to the current charges, and therefore inadmissible. This decision eliminated Walsh's ability to present evidence of Daniel's Silver Star, Purple Heart, and commendations for valor that might have countered the prosecution's portrayal of him as inherently dangerous. "Your Honor," Walsh had argued, during a sidebar conference, "my client's military service record directly contradicts the state's characterization of him as an unstable veteran prone to violence. These records show 30 years of exemplary service to his country." "Ms. Walsh," Judge Morrison replied with barely concealed impatience, "we're not trying your client's military service, we're trying the specific charges brought against him in this courtroom. His war record, whatever it may contain, has no bearing on whether he threatened 3 young men in a diner." The ruling was devastating because it allowed the prosecution to reference Daniel's military training as evidence of his capacity for violence, while preventing the defense from showing that same service had been characterized by honor, sacrifice, and protection of others. It was like being allowed to mention that someone owned a gun, while being forbidden from explaining they were a police officer. Walsh's attempts to present character witnesses met similar obstacles. Daniel's former students from Marion Community College, where he had taught American history for 30 years, were eager to testify about his character, patience, and dedication to helping young people understand their country's struggles with justice and equality. But Judge Morrison ruled that character witnesses were cumulative and limited Walsh to just 2. The first character witness was Dr. Margaret Chen, Daniel's former department head at the community college. Dr. Chen, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s, testified that Daniel had been one of the most respected faculty members in her 4 decades at the college. Professor Rigg was beloved by his students, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to education. In 30 years of teaching, I never received a single complaint about his conduct. Students often told me that his classes changed their perspectives on American history and civil rights. But Carlyle's cross-examination quickly turned Dr. Chen's testimony against Daniel. Dr. Chen, were you aware that Professor Rigg frequently discussed violence in his classes? He taught about historical violence, yes. The Civil War, both world wars, Vietnam. And did he ever discuss his personal experiences with violence? Dr. Chen hesitated, suddenly understanding the trap. He occasionally shared his experiences as a veteran to help students understand the human cost of war. So he regularly talked about killing and violence with impressionable young people. That's not what I said at all. He helped students understand history through personal experience. But the damage was done. Carlyle had managed to make Daniel's excellent teaching record sound like evidence that he was obsessed with violence and used his classroom to intimidate students. The second character witness was Maria Rodriguez, the waitress from Murphy's Diner, who had witnessed the actual incident. Maria's testimony should have been devastating to the prosecution's case, but Walsh lacked the experience to present it effectively. Mrs. Rodriguez, you were working at Murphy's Diner on the morning in question? Walsh asked. Yes, I was. Mr. Rigg comes in almost every morning. He's always polite, always tips well, never causes any trouble. What did you observe that morning? Those 3 boys came in drunk and loud. They were saying terrible things about Mr. Rigg because he's black. He asked them very politely to be quieter, that's all that happened. But Carlyle's cross-examination revealed why the prosecution hadn't been worried about Maria's testimony. During 20 minutes of aggressive questioning, Carlyle established that Maria was an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who had been working at the diner without proper papers for 15 years. Mrs. Rodriguez, you're not legally authorized to work in the United States, are you? Maria's face went pale. I have been trying to get papers, and you understand that testifying here today puts you at risk of deportation. Objection! Walsh finally found her voice. The witness's immigration status is irrelevant to what she observed. Sustained, Judge Morrison ruled, but again the damage was done. The jury now viewed Maria as someone who might lie to avoid deportation, and her testimony about what really happened in the diner was tainted. Worse still, 2 other diner employees who had been scheduled to testify in Daniel's defense suddenly became unavailable. Carlos Mendez, the cook who had witnessed the entire incident, called in sick on the morning he was supposed to testify. Later investigation would reveal that he had received an anonymous phone call threatening to report his immigration status to ICE if he appeared in court. The breakfast regular who had been sitting 3 tables away from Daniel and could have corroborated Maria's account simply failed to show up. He later told a reporter that his employer had suggested it might not be wise to get involved in such a controversial case. Daniel's health began deteriorating under the stress of the trial. The shrapnel wounds he'd received in Vietnam, which had been manageable for decades, began causing severe pain that left him visibly uncomfortable in the courtroom. His left leg, injured when his patrol hit a landmine outside Da Nang in 1971, swelled to the point where he could barely walk. "Dad, you need to see a doctor," his daughter Michelle whispered during a court recess. "You look like you're in agony." "I can't afford to look weak in front of this jury," Daniel replied, gritting his teeth against a wave of pain. "They already think I'm dangerous. If they see me as sick and unstable too, it's over." But his deteriorating condition only made things worse. Jurors watched him grimace when he stood, saw him favor his injured leg, and observed the way his hands sometimes trembled from pain medication. Rather than evoking sympathy, his visible suffering seemed to confirm the prosecution's narrative that he was an unstable veteran whose body and mind had been damaged by war. The impact on Daniel's family was devastating. Michelle had exhausted her savings to travel back and forth from Chicago for the trial, and her employer at Northwestern Memorial Hospital was growing impatient with her extended absences. Her teenage son Marcus was being bullied at school by classmates who had seen his grandfather's mugshot on the news. "They're calling Grandpa a terrorist," Marcus told his mother during one of their nightly phone calls. "They say he's going to prison for threatening to kill white people." Even worse, some members of Daniel's own community began distancing themselves from him as the media coverage intensified. The pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church, where Daniel had been a member for 20 years, suggested it might be best if he didn't attend services until this situation was resolved. Several longtime friends stopped returning his phone calls from the county jail. "I understand their position," Daniel told Michelle during one of her visits. "They have families to protect, businesses to run. They can't afford to be associated with someone the whole city thinks is a criminal." The local media coverage became increasingly hostile as the trial progressed. Channel 8's evening newscast featured a segment titled "Veteran Violence in Our Community" that included interviews with unnamed experts who discussed the epidemic of unstable veterans threatening civilians. "We're seeing more and more cases like this," claimed Dr. Robert Sterling, a psychiatrist who had never treated a veteran but appeared regularly on local television as an expert on various topics. "These men come home from war zones and never fully integrate back into peaceful society. They see threats everywhere and respond with the violence they were trained to use." The segment showed stock footage of combat in Vietnam while discussing Daniel's case, reinforcing the connection between his military service and supposed propensity for violence. No mention was made of the millions of veterans who had served honorably and returned to productive civilian lives. By the fourth day of trial, Daniel was seriously considering accepting a plea bargain that would have resulted in 18 months in prison and 5 years of probation. The prospect of spending even a day in prison for something he hadn't done made him physically sick, but the alternative seemed to be a lengthy sentence after inevitable conviction. "Mr. Rigg, I have to be honest with you," Walsh said during their final strategy meeting. "The prosecution's case is strong and our defense has been limited by the court's rulings. A plea bargain might be your best option." Daniel looked at his court-appointed attorney, this young woman who had tried her best with inadequate resources and impossible circumstances. "Ms. Walsh, if I plead guilty to something I didn't do, doesn't that make me a liar? And if I go to prison for a crime I didn't commit, doesn't that make this whole system a lie?" Walsh had no answer for that. She was 28 years old, 3 years out of law school, handling her first major trial, and slowly realizing that the justice system she had believed in was failing right in front of her eyes. As Daniel returned to his cell that night, he found himself thinking about the young Marines who had served under him in Vietnam. He had taught them that America was worth fighting for, that the Constitution and Bill of Rights represented ideals worth dying to protect. Many of them had died believing those words. Now, 50 years later, Daniel was discovering that those ideals meant nothing when measured against the word of 3 privileged teenagers who had never sacrificed anything for their country. The Constitution he had sworn to defend seemed powerless to protect him from lies told by people who saw his skin color and military service as evidence of guilt rather than honor. The irony was not lost on him that he was being prosecuted in a courthouse built with tax dollars he had paid during 30 years of honest work, in a country he had bled to defend, by people who had never worn the uniform or faced enemy fire. Justice, he was learning, was not blind after all. It saw color, it saw class, and it saw what it wanted to see. The prosecution's star witness took the stand on the 5th day of trial with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Tyler Morrison, dressed in a conservative gray suit that made him look younger and more innocent than his 19 years, settled into the witness chair and looked directly at the jury with carefully practiced sincerity. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle approached the witness stand with the measured pace of a prosecutor who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. Her questions were designed to elicit maximum emotional impact while reinforcing the narrative she had been building since her opening statement. "Tyler, I want you to take your time and tell the jury exactly what happened on the morning of March 15th at Murphy's Diner," Carlisle began, her voice gentle and encouraging. Tyler took a deep breath as if summoning courage to relive a traumatic experience. "My friends Jake and Brett and I had been studying all night for midterm exams. We decided to grab breakfast before heading home to sleep. We were just trying to have a normal meal when this man," he pointed dramatically at Daniel, "decided we were too loud for his liking." The pointing gesture was deliberate, designed to make Daniel appear threatening even while sitting silently at the defense table. Several jurors followed Tyler's gesture and stared at Daniel with obvious suspicion. "What happened next?" Carlisle prompted. "At first, he just stared at us with these cold, calculating eyes, like he was studying us, figuring out our weaknesses. Then he stood up and walked over to our table. He was big, intimidating, and he had this way of moving that made it clear he knew how to hurt people." Daniel had never approached their table, never stood up except when the police arrived, but Tyler delivered this fabrication with such conviction that 2 jurors took notes. The lie was becoming truth through repetition and performance. "Did the defendant say anything to you?" Tyler nodded gravely. He said, and I'll never forget these exact words, "Young men like you need to learn respect, and I know ways to teach it that you'll never forget." Then he started talking about his time in Vietnam, how he had dealt with disrespectful punks before. Again, pure fabrication, but Tyler's delivery made it sound like a quote he had memorized through trauma rather than invented through malice. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, adding authenticity to his performance. "How did that make you feel?" "Terrified," Tyler replied without hesitation. This was a trained killer telling us he knew how to hurt us in ways we couldn't imagine. He kept mentioning his military service like it was a threat. He said local police couldn't protect us if he decided we needed to be educated. Jennifer. Walsh objected to the hearsay, but Judge Morrison allowed Tyler to continue, describing his emotional state rather than quoting Daniel directly. It was a distinction without a difference that allowed Tyler to put words in Daniel's mouth while technically avoiding direct quotation. "Tyler, did you feel that you and your friends were in immediate danger?" "Absolutely. This man was a trained sniper who had killed people in war. He was making it clear that he could do the same to us if we didn't show him what he considered proper respect. We were just college kids trying to eat breakfast, and this veteran was threatening to hurt us because we were talking normally." Carlisle spent 40 minutes walking Tyler through his fabricated account, each question designed to reinforce the image of Daniel as a dangerous predator who had used his military training to terrorize innocent young men. Tyler's performance was flawless, complete with strategic pauses, emotional tremors, and direct eye contact with sympathetic jurors. The most damaging moment came when Carlisle asked Tyler to describe Daniel's demeanor during the alleged threats. "He had this look in his eyes that I can only describe as predatory," Tyler said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that forced the jury to lean forward, like he was deciding which one of us he would hurt first. He kept flexing his hands, like he was imagining what it would feel like to wrap them around our throats. Daniel had done no such thing, but Tyler's description was so vivid and specific that it felt real to jurors who had never witnessed actual violence. The fabricated detail about hand flexing was particularly effective because it suggested premeditation and gave the threat a physical component that made it more frightening. Jake Sullivan followed Tyler to the witness stand, his testimony carefully coordinated to support his friend's lies while adding new details that made the fabricated incident seem more elaborate and threatening. The defendant kept talking about his connections in the military, Jake testified. He said he knew people who could make problems disappear quietly, people who knew how to handle situations without involving local law enforcement. This was a particularly insidious lie because it suggested that Daniel had not only threatened the teenagers, but had also claimed to have access to some kind of criminal network of violent veterans. It played into paranoid fantasies about secret, military cabals, while making Daniel appear to be part of a larger threat to community safety. Brett Collins completed the trilogy of perjury with testimony that added psychological manipulation to the mix of fabricated threats. The defendant said he could tell we came from privileged families, that we probably thought we were better than people like him, Brett testified. He said rich kids like us needed to learn that money couldn't protect us from men who had killed for their country. This testimony was designed to appeal to jurors who might have some resentment toward wealthy, privileged young people by suggesting that Daniel's threats were motivated by class warfare rather than simple irritation at their noise level. It also reinforced the prosecution's theme that Daniel's military service had made him dangerous rather than honorable. Officer Michael Patterson's testimony built on the teenager's lies by embellishing his police report with details that hadn't appeared in his original documentation. When we arrived at the scene, the defendant was agitated and confrontational, Patterson testified. He kept mentioning his military service and making references to his combat experience. We had to use assertive verbal commands to get him to comply with our instructions. In reality, Daniel had been completely cooperative during his arrest. But Patterson's testimony suggested that he had been difficult and potentially violent. The officer's uniform and badge gave his lies an official authority that made them more credible to jurors than the truth would have been. Did the defendant make any statements that concerned you about his mental state? Carlyle asked. Yes, ma'am. He kept talking about how young people today didn't understand respect, and how he had learned ways to teach respect in Vietnam that were more effective than anything civilian authorities could do. Again, Daniel had made no such statements, but Patterson delivered this fabrication with the professional demeanor of a law enforcement officer reporting facts rather than inventing them. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that tied together all the fabricated testimony into a narrative of barely averted tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from 3 young men whose only crime was enjoying a meal at a local restaurant, Carlyle began, her voice rising with righteous indignation. You have heard how they were terrorized by a man who used his military training not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and threaten. She paused dramatically, scanning the jury box to make eye contact with each juror. The defendant wants you to believe that his military service makes him a hero. But what kind of hero threatens college students? What kind of patriot uses his training to terrorize the very people he was supposed to protect? Carlyle's closing lasted 53 minutes and systematically dismantled every possible sympathy that jurors might have felt for Daniel. His military service became evidence of his capacity for violence. His calm demeanor during trial became proof that he was calculating and manipulative. His age became a factor that made him more dangerous, not less, because it suggested years of accumulated resentment. Daniel Rigg is not the victim here, Carlyle concluded. He is a man who decided that 3 young people deserved to be terrorized because they didn't show him what he considered proper deference. Your verdict must send a clear message that this community will not tolerate veterans who use their training to threaten innocent civilians. Jennifer Walsh's closing argument was a pale shadow of the prosecution's presentation, hampered by her inexperience and the court's rulings that had prevented her from presenting evidence of Daniel's true character. Members of the jury, my client is not the monster the prosecution has painted, Walsh began weakly. He is a 66-year-old retired teacher who simply asked some loud teenagers to be more considerate of other customers. But Walsh lacked the resources and experience to effectively counter the prosecution's narrative. She couldn't present Daniel's military decorations, couldn't call character witnesses who might have testified to his peaceful nature, and couldn't investigate the backgrounds of his accusers to expose their lies. Judge Morrison's jury instructions seemed to favor the prosecution, emphasizing that the jurors should consider the totality of the defendant's conduct, and that military training could be considered as evidence of the defendant's capacity to carry out threatened violence. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Daniel watched their faces for any sign of sympathy or doubt. He saw none. The 12 people who would decide his fate looked at him with a mixture of fear, distrust and something worse, the cold certainty that they had already made up their minds. The prosecution had successfully transformed a simple misunderstanding into a federal case, a polite request for quiet into a terrorist threat, and a decorated war hero into a dangerous predator. The lies told by three privileged teenagers had been given the weight of truth, while the truth of Daniel's character had been deemed irrelevant by the court. The jury deliberated for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, barely enough time to elect a foreman, take a preliminary vote, and fill out the verdict forms. Court observers who had followed the trial knew that such a quick deliberation almost always meant a conviction, but the speed still shocked Daniel's supporters, who had hoped that reasonable doubt might require more consideration. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed when the jury returned, with Daniel's family occupying the first row behind the defense table, while Tyler Morrison's supporters filled the opposite side. Media representatives filled every available seat, their cameras focused on Daniel's face as the moment of truth approached. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked, as the 12 jurors filed back into their seats. "We have, Your Honor," replied Thomas Bradley, a 62-year-old insurance agent who had been elected foreman. Bradley held the verdict forms with steady hands, his expression revealing nothing about what the jury had decided. "On the charge of terroristic threatening in the second degree, how do you find?" Bradley's voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant, Daniel Rigg, guilty." The word guilty hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he maintained his military posture and showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. Behind him, his daughter Michelle gasped audibly, while Tyler Morrison's mother smiled with satisfaction. "On the charge of disturbing the peace, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Judge Morrison thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. As the gavel struck the wooden block with finality, Daniel Rigg officially became a convicted felon, his spotless 66-year record of citizenship destroyed by lies told under oath. The media reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Channel T8 led their evening newscast with "Guilty Veteran Convicted of Terroristic Threats," showing Daniel's mugshot next to footage of him being led from the courtroom in handcuffs. The story portrayed the verdict as a victory for community safety and a warning to other veterans who might consider using their military training to intimidate civilians. "This conviction sends a clear message," District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle told reporters on the courthouse steps. "Military service, no matter how distinguished, does not give anyone the right to threaten innocent people. Our community is safer tonight because this dangerous individual will face the consequences of his actions." The sentencing hearing 1 week later was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maximize Daniel's punishment while minimizing any sympathy the court might feel for his age or service record. Carlisle had prepared meticulously, lining up victim impact statements and expert testimony that would justify the harshest possible sentence. Tyler Morrison was the first to address the court during victim impact statements, his performance even more polished than his trial testimony. Dressed in a dark suit and speaking with practiced emotion, Tyler painted a picture of lasting trauma and ongoing fear. "Your Honor, what Daniel Rigg did to us that morning has changed our lives forever," Tyler began, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I used to love going out with friends, enjoying simple pleasures like breakfast at a local diner. Now I'm afraid to go anywhere without looking over my shoulder, wondering if some unstable veteran might decide I deserve to be taught a lesson." Tyler's mother, Patricia Morrison, followed with her own statement about the devastating impact Daniel's actions had on their family. "We've had to install a security system in our home because we're afraid he might come after Tyler when he gets out of prison," she said, dabbing at tears with a tissue. "My son has nightmares about being hunted by a trained killer who thinks he did something wrong by simply existing while white." The racial component of Patricia Morrison's statement was subtle but unmistakable, designed to tap into fears about angry black men seeking revenge against white families. It was a particularly vicious touch that transformed Daniel from an individual defendant into a symbol of racial resentment. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins delivered similar statements, each emphasizing their ongoing fear and the supposed trauma of being threatened by a professional killer. Their parents followed with their own accounts of how the incident had affected their families, creating a chorus of white victimhood that dominated the sentencing hearing. Dr. Patricia Hendricks returned to provide expert testimony about the ongoing danger Daniel represented to the community. Your Honor, the defendant's military training combined with his demonstrated willingness to threaten civilians makes him an exceptional risk for recidivism, she testified. Veterans like Mr. Rigg often escalate their behavior when they feel their initial intimidation tactics have been unsuccessful. Again, Dr. Hendricks had never examined Daniel and based her testimony on no actual evidence, but her credentials gave weight to speculation presented as expert opinion. Her recommendation for maximum incarceration was exactly what Carlisle needed to justify a harsh sentence. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Daniel rose slowly from the defense table, his injured leg causing him visible discomfort. He had prepared no formal statement, choosing instead to speak from the heart about his service, his character, and his innocence. Your Honor, I have never in my life threatened another human being outside of combat situations where my country asked me to defend freedom and democracy, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I served 4 tours in Vietnam, not because I enjoyed violence, but because I believed in protecting the rights and freedoms that make America special. He paused, looking directly at Judge Morrison. I asked 3 young men to lower their voices. In a restaurant. That is all I did. I made no threats, used no intimidating language, and displayed no aggressive behavior. The witnesses who could confirm this were intimidated into silence, while those who lied under oath were rewarded with victim status. Daniel's statement lasted only 3 minutes, but it carried the dignity and authority of a man who had faced enemy fire and refused to be broken by civilian injustice. I will not apologize for something I did not do, and I will not dishonor my service by pretending that asking for common courtesy is equivalent to making terrorist threats. Judge Morrison's sentencing decision reflected the political pressure he faced and his own apparent belief in the prosecution's narrative. Mr. Rigg, while I acknowledge your military service, that service does not excuse your conduct on the morning in question, Morrison began. You used your size, your military bearing, and your combat experience to intimidate 3 young men who were doing nothing more than enjoying a meal. The judge continued for 10 minutes, essentially accepting the prosecution's version of events as fact, while dismissing Daniel's denials as self-serving lies. The court sentences you to 5 years imprisonment in the Indiana Department of Corrections, with the possibility of parole after serving 60% of your sentence. The sentence was harsh even by the standards of Marion County, where judges routinely gave lighter punishment to defendants convicted of actual assault. But Daniel had become a symbol rather than an individual, and his punishment was designed to send a message about the consequences of challenging white privilege while black. As Daniel was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and leg shackles, protesters outside cheered the result. Signs reading "Justice for Tyler" and "Lock up dangerous veterans" waved in the air as news cameras captured the moment for evening broadcasts across Indianapolis. Michelle Rigg collapsed in tears as she watched, her father being taken away to begin a prison sentence for a crime he hadn't committed. The man who had taught her about justice, equality, and the Constitution was being destroyed by the very system he had fought to defend. The transport van that carried Daniel to Pendleton Correctional Facility was a final indignity in a process that had stripped him of everything except his dignity and his knowledge of the truth. As Indianapolis disappeared behind them, Daniel reflected on the country he had served and the ideals he had believed in. He had been convicted by a jury that saw his skin color and military service as evidence of guilt rather than honor. He had been sentenced by a judge who valued political expediency over justice. He had been abandoned by a community that chose comfortable lies over inconvenient truths. But even as the prison gates closed behind him, Daniel Rigg remained unbroken. Somewhere in the darkness of his cell, he held on to the truth of what had really happened in Murphy's Diner, and the hope that someday, somehow, justice would prevail. Comment number 1 if you believe Daniel received a fair trial, or comment number 2 if you think the system failed him completely. Hit that like button if you're outraged by this miscarriage of justice, and don't forget to subscribe because you absolutely need to see what happens next. Can an innocent man survive in prison while maintaining his dignity and principles? Will the truth about that morning in the diner ever come to light? And who is the mysterious figure about to enter this story with information that could change everything? The next chapter will leave you speechless with revelations that nobody saw. Coming. Pendleton Correctional Facility's intake process was designed to strip away every vestige of dignity and individuality from new inmates, transforming them from citizens into numbers in the Indiana Department of Correction system. Daniel Rigg endured the humiliation with the same stoic discipline that had carried him through enemy interrogation training in the Marines, but the psychological impact was devastating for a man who had spent his entire life serving others. The strip search, conducted by guards who seemed to take pleasure in ordering around the terrorist veteran, was followed by a delousing shower with industrial soap that burned his skin. Daniel's personal effects, including the wedding ring he had worn for 43 years until his wife's death, were catalogued and stored in a property room he might never see again. Inmate 74986, the processing guard announced, reading from Daniel's new identification bracelet. You're in cell block D, tier 3. Keep your mouth shut, follow orders, and you might make it out of here in one piece. Daniel's cellmate was Marcus Williams, a 24-year-old from Gary, who was serving 8 years for armed robbery. Marcus had been prepared to assert dominance over the old man assigned to share his 12 by 8-foot concrete box, but something about Daniel's bearing made him reconsider his usual intimidation tactics. So what they got you in here for, Pops? Marcus asked as Daniel made up his narrow bunk with military precision. They say I threatened some college kids, Daniel replied quietly. Truth is, I asked them to lower their voices in a restaurant. Marcus laughed bitterly. Man, they'll lock us up for breathing while black. What you do before this happened, taught. American history at Marion Community College for 30 years. Before that, 4 tours in Vietnam with the Marines. The mention of military service changed the entire dynamic of their relationship. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's service in World War II, and despite his criminal record, he maintained deep respect for veterans who had served their country. Vietnam, huh? My uncle was over there, said it was hell. On Earth. It was, Daniel confirmed. But we did our duty, came home and tried to build something better. Word of Daniel's military service spread quickly through the prison population, carried by the informal communication network that exists in every correctional facility. Within a week, even hardened criminals were treating the 66-year-old history teacher with a respect that surprised the guards. That old man in D Block fought in Vietnam, inmates would whisper to newcomers. Killed communists for his country, then came home and taught kids about freedom. Don't mess with him unless you want problems. Daniel's daily routine became a study in dignity maintained under impossible circumstances. He woke at 5:30 a.m., as he had for 50 years, and spent an hour in silent reflection before the morning count. He attended every educational program the prison offered, tutoring younger inmates in basic literacy and helping them prepare for GED examinations. Letters began arriving within 2 weeks of Daniel's incarceration, first dozens, then hundreds, from veterans across America who had heard about his case through military networks and social media. The American Legion post in Terre Haute sent a package of books and magazines. Veterans of foreign wars chapters from 12 states wrote expressing support and outrage at his treatment. Brother, we got your 6, wrote Sergeant Major Robert Chen, a Vietnam veteran from California. What they did to you is an insult to every man and woman who ever wore the uniform. Don't let them break you. Justice is coming. The letters provided Daniel with something he had lost during the trial, proof that not everyone believed the lies told about him in that Indianapolis courtroom. Fellow veterans understood that military service created bonds of honor and mutual respect that civilians often failed to comprehend. Michelle exhausted her savings and borrowed against her Chicago home, to hire appellate attorney David Harrison, a former Marine who specialized in cases involving veterans wrongfully convicted by civilian courts. Harrison's initial review of Daniel's case revealed multiple constitutional violations and procedural errors that should have resulted in mistrial. "Your father's trial was a travesty," Harrison told Michelle during their first meeting. The court's refusal to admit his military service record, the intimidation of defense witnesses, the prosecutor's inflammatory statements about veterans in general, any one of these issues should be grounds for reversal. But appeals moved slowly through the Indiana court system, and Daniel was settling into the grim reality of prison life while lawyers filed motions and argued legal technicalities that might take years to resolve. The first crack in the wall of lies surrounding Daniel's conviction came from an unexpected source, investigative journalist Patricia Santos of the Indianapolis Star. Santos had covered the trial and been troubled by inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that other reporters had ignored. Her investigation revealed that Tyler Morrison had been arrested twice for underage drinking and once for marijuana possession, charges that had been dropped through his family's political connections. Jake Sullivan had been suspended from college for academic dishonesty, while Brett Collins had a sealed juvenile record for assault that his wealthy parents had managed to expunge. These weren't innocent college students, traumatized by a dangerous veteran, Santos wrote in a series of articles that began appearing 6 months after Daniel's conviction. These were privileged young men with histories of lying to authority figures, whose word was taken over that of a decorated war hero simply because of the color of his skin. Santos's articles generated renewed interest in Daniel's case among civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups. The NAACP assigned lawyers to review his conviction, while the Veterans Legal Defense Fund began preparing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Marion County. 8 months into Daniel's sentence, Michelle received a phone call that would change everything. She was working a double shift at Northwestern Memorial Hospital when her phone rang with a call from an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Is this Michelle Rigg, daughter of Daniel Rigg?" the caller asked in a voice that carried unmistakable military authority. "Yes, who is this, sir? My name is General Samuel Wyatt, United States Army, retired. I've been searching for your father for over 40 years, and I just learned about his situation through a friend at the Pentagon who saw the news coverage." Michelle felt her heart racing. "General, I don't understand. What do you know about my father?" "Miss Rigg, your father saved my life and the lives of 37 other American soldiers in Vietnam in 1973. What happened to him in that courtroom is not just a personal tragedy. It's a national disgrace that dishonors every veteran who ever served this country." General Wyatt explained that he had been a young lieutenant when his reconnaissance patrol was ambushed by North Vietnamese forces near the Cambodian border. For 6 hours, Daniel had held off an entire enemy company with precision sniper fire, allowing helicopters to evacuate the wounded, while calling in artillery strikes that broke the enemy assault. "Your father was recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor," General Wyatt continued, "but the paperwork got lost in the chaos of the war's end, and racial prejudice in the military bureaucracy ensured that his heroism was never properly recognized. So I've carried that guilt for 50 years. General, can you help him? Can you testify about what really happened over there? I'm flying to Indianapolis tonight. I have classified documents that were declassified last year, military records that prove your father is one of the greatest heroes of the Vietnam War. This conviction is an insult to his service and to every principle this nation claims to represent." As General Wyatt spoke, Michelle realized that her father's nightmare might finally be ending. Somewhere in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon, evidence existed that could vindicate Daniel and expose the lies that had destroyed his reputation. "General Wyatt, my father is scheduled to be transferred to maximum security tomorrow morning because they claim he's been organizing other inmates. If you're going to help him, it has to be now." "I'll be there before sunrise," the general promised. "Your father has waited 50 years for the recognition he deserves. He won't wait another day." As Michelle hung up the phone, she felt hope for the first time since her father's arrest. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or the final crushing of an innocent man's spirit. But tonight, for the first time in months, she dared to believe that truth might actually matter more than lies, and that justice might not be completely dead in America. General Samuel Wyatt's helicopter touched down on the Marion County Courthouse parking lot at 6:47 a.m., just as the morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Indianapolis. The three-star general emerged from the aircraft carrying a briefcase containing classified documents that had been declassified only 18 months earlier, papers that would expose one of the most shameful cover-ups in modern American military history. Wyatt cut an imposing figure even at 71 years old, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his dress uniform bearing ribbons that represented 4 decades of distinguished service, including 3 combat tours and a Distinguished Service Cross earned in Afghanistan. But nothing in his impressive military career meant more to him than the debt he owed to Daniel Rigg. The media had been alerted to the general's arrival by Michelle, and cameras from every major network affiliate in Indiana captured the moment, when Wyatt strode up the courthouse steps with the bearing of a man on a mission of honor. Behind him walked Colonel Patricia Davis, a Pentagon spokesperson, and Major James Rodriguez, a military historian who had helped piece together the true story of what happened near Firebase Alpha in 1973. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Wyatt announced to the assembled reporters, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I am here to present evidence that will prove Daniel Rigg is not only innocent of the charges brought against him, but is one of the greatest heroes in the history of American military service." Inside the courthouse, emergency hearings were already being convened as word spread that new evidence had emerged in the Daniel Rigg case. Judge Morrison, facing intense political pressure from the governor's office and the Pentagon, agreed to an immediate evidentiary hearing that would determine whether Daniel's conviction could stand in light of the revelations about to be presented. General Wyatt's testimony began with a detailed account of Operation Silent Thunder, a classified reconnaissance mission that had taken place on March 26, 1973, in the jungles near the Cambodian border. Lieutenant Samuel Wyatt's patrol had been tasked with gathering intelligence on North Vietnamese troop movements when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. "We were pinned down by an entire enemy company," General Wyatt testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. "3 of my men were already dead, and the rest of us were wounded. We had no chance of survival unless someone could provide covering fire to allow helicopter evacuation. That someone was Marine Corporal Daniel Rigg, positioned on a ridge 800 meters away with his M40 sniper rifle. For the next 6 hours, while enemy forces tried to overrun the trapped patrol, Daniel systematically eliminated enemy machine gun positions, mortar crews, and squad leaders with precision that bordered on superhuman. Corporal Rigg killed 43 enemy soldiers that day, General Wyatt continued. But more importantly, his accurate fire allowed us to call in artillery strikes and helicopter gunships that saved 37 American lives, including mine. The classified documents General Wyatt presented told a story that had been buried for 50 years in Pentagon filing cabinets. Daniel's commanding officer, Major William Carson, had recommended him for the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for military valor. Supporting statements from every survivor of the ambush confirmed that Daniel's actions had prevented a massacre, but the recommendation had disappeared into the military bureaucracy during the chaotic final months of American involvement in Vietnam. When Major Carson was killed in a helicopter crash 3 weeks later, no one else followed up on Daniel's nomination for the Medal of Honor. What happened next was one of the most shameful episodes in modern military history, Colonel Davis testified, reading from previously classified internal Pentagon memos. When Corporal Rigg's Medal of Honor recommendation was reviewed in Washington, it was rejected, not because his actions didn't merit the honor, but because of institutional racism that pervaded the military hierarchy. One memo, written by a Pentagon official whose name had been redacted but whose racism was explicit, stated that Negro soldiers should not be awarded the nation's highest honor as it sends the wrong message about military leadership, and could encourage unrest among colored troops. Daniel's heroism had been deliberately suppressed, his Medal of Honor recommendation filed away and forgotten, because military officials in 1973 believed that recognizing a black soldier's extraordinary valor would threaten white supremacy in the armed forces. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Within hours, every major news network in America was broadcasting the story of how a genuine war hero had been denied recognition for 50 years, then falsely convicted of terrorism for asking teenagers to be quiet in a restaurant. Social media exploded with outrage as the hashtag #YarJusticeForDanielRigg began trending nationally. Veterans organizations across the country issued statements demanding Daniel's immediate release and full exoneration. The veterans of foreign wars called his conviction an insult to every American who ever wore the uniform, while the American Legion demanded congressional hearings into both his false conviction and the military's suppression of his heroic service. Political leaders rushed to distance themselves from the injustice as public opinion shifted dramatically in Daniel's favor. Governor Jennifer Martinez called Daniel's conviction a stain on Indiana's commitment to justice and demanded an immediate review. Senators from both parties issued statements calling for federal intervention, while the White House announced that President Williams was deeply concerned about the case. The most dramatic moment came when General Wyatt presented the final piece of evidence, testimony from the 3 teenagers who had fabricated the charges against Daniel. Under pressure from renewed FBI investigation triggered by the national attention, Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins had finally admitted that they had lied under oath. "We made it all up," Tyler confessed in a video statement recorded by federal investigators. "Mr. Rigg never threatened us. He just asked us to be quieter, and we got mad because we were drunk and thought he was being disrespectful. We figured no one would believe an old black man over 3 white college students." The confession was devastating, not just for its admission of perjury, but for its casual racism and privileged assumption that the justice system would automatically side with white accusers over a black defendant. Tyler's statement revealed the ugly truth that Daniel's conviction had been based entirely on racial prejudice, disguised as concern for public safety. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins provided similar confessions, each admitting that they had fabricated their testimony and coordinated their lies to ensure consistency. They revealed that Tyler's family had hired a lawyer to coach them on their testimony, and that they had been promised that charges would never be filed against them if they maintained their false accusations. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle's response to the revelations was a masterpiece of political damage control that fooled no one. "If new evidence has emerged that calls into question Mr. Rigg's conviction, my office will of course review it thoroughly," she announced at a hastily called press conference. But the political calculus had already shifted decisively against her. Facing a mayoral election in 6 months, Carlisle found herself defending the prosecution of a war hero based on fabricated testimony from racist teenagers. Her poll numbers collapsed overnight as Indianapolis voters realized they had elected someone who valued political ambition over justice. By evening, crowds had gathered outside Pendleton Correctional Facility, demanding Daniel's immediate release. Veterans groups organized a convoy of motorcycles that stretched for miles along Interstate 70, their riders wearing patches that read, "Free Daniel Rigg and Honor Our Heroes." Inside the prison, Daniel learned about the day's revelations from news reports on the common room television. For the first time in 18 months, he allowed himself to believe that the truth might actually matter more than lies, and that the country he had served with honor might finally acknowledge the debt it owed him. As night fell over Indianapolis, emergency motions were being filed in both state and federal courts, demanding Daniel's immediate release. The weight of public opinion, political pressure, and undeniable evidence was finally breaking down the wall of lies that had imprisoned an innocent man for crimes he never committed. General Wyatt spent the evening in the Marriott Hotel downtown, preparing for what he hoped would be Daniel's release the following morning. After 50 years of carrying guilt about his failure to ensure proper recognition for the man who saved his life, Samuel Wyatt was finally in position to pay the debt that had haunted him for half a century. The emergency hearing convened at 8 a.m. sharp in Judge Morrison's courtroom, which was packed beyond capacity, with media representatives, veterans, civil rights activists, and curious citizens who wanted to witness what many were calling the most dramatic reversal in Indiana legal history. Outside, thousands of supporters had gathered in a peaceful demonstration that stretched for blocks around the courthouse. Judge Morrison, whose reputation would never recover from his role in Daniel's wrongful conviction, had no choice but to dismiss all charges against Daniel with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. The evidence presented by General Wyatt was so overwhelming and the teenager's confessions so damning that any other decision would have destroyed what remained of his judicial career. "Mr. Rigg," Judge Morrison said as Daniel stood before the bench in his orange prison uniform, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys who had volunteered their services, "this court finds that your conviction was based on perjured testimony and that substantial evidence of your innocence has been presented. All charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in cheers as Daniel, maintaining the same dignity he had shown throughout his ordeal, simply nodded his acknowledgement. General Wyatt, watching from the front row, felt 50 years of guilt lifting from his shoulders as justice was finally served. Daniel's release from custody was delayed only by the paperwork required to process him out of the state corrections system. When he finally walked through the gates of Pendleton Correctional Facility at 2:37 p.m., he was greeted by a crowd of over 5,000 supporters, including hundreds of veterans who had driven from across the Midwest to witness his vindication. The first person to reach Daniel was his daughter Michelle, who had maintained her faith in his innocence through 18 months of nightmare. Their embrace, captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast live across the nation, became an iconic image of justice delayed but not denied. General Wyatt was the second person to greet Daniel, and their meeting was charged with emotion that both men had held in check for decades. "Corporal Rigg," the general said, using Daniel's old military rank, "I owe you an apology that's 50 years overdue. You saved my life and 37 others, and this country failed to honor that sacrifice." "General," Daniel replied with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through his ordeal, "we both served our country to the best of our ability. That's all any soldier can do." The media frenzy surrounding Daniel's release continued for weeks, as his story became a symbol of both systemic racism and the power of truth to eventually overcome lies. Major networks competed to land interviews with the man who had been transformed overnight from convicted terrorist to national hero. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle's political career ended abruptly when she withdrew from the mayoral race, 3 days after Daniel's release, facing certain defeat and possible criminal charges for prosecuting a case she knew was based on fabricated evidence. Federal investigators opened a civil rights investigation into her office's conduct, leading to ethics violations that would eventually result in her disbarment. Officers Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh, the arresting officers who had embellished their reports and testimony, were fired from the Indianapolis Police Department and faced federal charges for violating Daniel's civil rights under color of law. Their termination sent a message throughout the department that racial bias and false testimony would no longer be tolerated. Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins were charged with perjury, filing false reports, and conspiracy to deny civil rights. Their guilty pleas resulted in prison sentences of 18 months each and civil judgments that bankrupted their families. Tyler's parents, who had orchestrated much of the cover-up, faced their own criminal charges and social ostracism from Indianapolis society. The civil lawsuit Daniel filed against Marion County, the Indianapolis Police Department, and the individual defendants resulted in a settlement of $15.7 million, making it one of the largest wrongful conviction awards in Indiana history. Daniel announced that he would donate most of the money to establish the Daniel Rigg Foundation for wrongfully convicted veterans, ensuring that other veterans facing similar injustices would have access to proper legal representation. 6 months after his release, Daniel was invited to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony that should have taken place 50 years earlier. In the Rose Garden of the White House, President Williams presented him with the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for military valor. "Corporal Daniel Rigg represents the best of America," President Williams said as he placed the blue ribbon around Daniel's neck. His heroism in Vietnam saved 37 American lives, and his dignity in the face of injustice has reminded us all that courage takes many forms. The ceremony was attended by the surviving members of General Wyatt's patrol, elderly men who had traveled from across the country to finally thank the man who had saved their lives half a century earlier. Many wept openly as they watched their rescuer receive the recognition that should have been his in 1973. Daniel's congressional testimony before the House Judiciary Committee's hearing on criminal justice reform became a watershed moment in the national conversation about racial bias in the legal system. His quiet, measured words about his experience carried more weight than academic studies or statistical analyses. "What happened to me was not an aberration," Daniel told the packed hearing room. "It was the predictable result of a system that values the word of privileged white accusers over the truth, and that sees military service by black veterans as evidence of dangerousness rather than patriotism." His testimony helped passage of the Veterans Justice Act, which mandated special training for prosecutors and judges handling cases involving military veterans, and created federal oversight of local jurisdictions with patterns of discriminatory prosecution. The community that had abandoned Daniel during his trial underwent its own process of reckoning and redemption. Cornerstone Baptist Church, which had asked him not to attend services during his legal troubles, held a special ceremony welcoming him back and apologizing for their failure to support him. The congregation raised money for his foundation and established an annual scholarship in his name. Marion Community College, where Daniel had taught for 30 years, renamed its history department the Daniel Rigg Center for Justice Education and invited him to return as a distinguished professor emeritus. His first lecture upon returning drew an overflow crowd of students, faculty, and community members, eager to hear from a man who had lived through some of the most important moments in American history. Murphy's Diner, where the entire ordeal had begun, became an unlikely pilgrimage site for visitors who wanted to see where an American hero had been falsely accused. The diner's owners installed a plaque commemorating Daniel's service and his vindication, and Maria Rodriguez, the waitress whose testimony had been dismissed, was promoted to assistant manager in recognition of her courage in telling the truth. 1 year after his release, Daniel returned to Murphy's Diner for the first time since his arrest. The same booth where he had been reading his newspaper that quiet morning was now marked with a small bronze plaque reading, "In honor of Medal of Honor, recipient Daniel Rigg, American Hero." As Daniel sat in that booth, drinking the same black coffee he had ordered on that fateful morning, he reflected on the journey that had taken him from respected teacher to convicted felon to national symbol of justice. The path had been painful beyond measure, but it had ultimately revealed truths about America that needed to be confronted. Young people approached his table throughout the morning, asking for selfies and expressing gratitude for his service. A group of black teenagers told him that his story had inspired them to pursue careers in law and criminal justice, determined to prevent other innocent people from suffering similar injustices. "Mr. Rigg," one of them said, "you showed us that, even when the whole system is against you, truth can still win if you don't give up." Daniel smiled, remembering the scared young Marines he had led through the jungles of Vietnam 50 years earlier. "Truth always wins eventually," he replied. "Sometimes it just takes longer than we'd like." As the morning crowd thinned out, Daniel opened his copy of the Indianapolis Star to read about the latest developments in criminal justice reform. The headline on the front page read, "Daniel Rigg Foundation awards first scholarships to law students committed to justice," and featured a photo of him with 12 young people who would carry forward his mission of ensuring equal justice under law. The circle was complete. The man who had been destroyed by lies had been redeemed by truth, and his suffering had become a catalyst for change that would protect future generations from similar injustices. In a booth at Murphy's Diner, an American hero continued the fight for justice that had defined his entire life. Comment number 1. If you believe Daniel's story proves that truth always prevails, Or comment number 2 if you think systemic change is still needed to prevent future injustices. Smash that like button if this incredible journey of redemption restored your faith in justice, and make sure to subscribe, because Daniel Rigg's story is just one of many tales of American heroes who refuse to be broken by injustice. What other stories of courage and perseverance would you like to hear? Should we investigate more cases of veterans wrongfully convicted by a biased system? Let us know in the comments what hidden stories of heroism you think deserve to be told, because every American deserves to know the truth about the people who sacrifice everything to protect our freedom. Daniel Rigg's story reveals profound truths about justice, courage, and the ongoing struggle for equality in America. His experience demonstrates that military service and decades of honorable citizenship offer no protection against racial bias when the system chooses to believe lies over truth. The ease with which 3 privileged teenagers destroyed a war hero's reputation exposes how deeply embedded prejudice remains in our institutions. The most powerful lesson is that individual dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. Daniel maintained his honor throughout 18 months of imprisonment, refusing to confess to crimes he never committed. His unwavering commitment to truth, even when it seemed futile, ultimately led to vindication and justice. This case also illustrates the critical importance of investigative journalism and advocacy groups in exposing wrongful convictions. Without Patricia Santos's reporting and General Wyatt's intervention, Daniel might have served his entire sentence while the truth remained buried in Pentagon files. Perhaps most significantly, Daniel's story shows that redemption is possible, even after devastating injustice. His decision to establish a foundation helping other wrongfully convicted veterans transforms personal suffering into systemic change. His example proves that heroes are defined not by their inability to be knocked down, but by their refusal to stay down. True justice requires constant vigilance from citizens willing to demand accountability from their institutions and protection for the innocent. What strikes you most about Daniel's incredible journey from decorated war hero to wrongfully convicted prisoner to Medal of Honor recipient? Comment below and tell us, have you or someone you know ever faced injustice because of racial bias? Share your thoughts about how we can better protect veterans and minorities from false accusations in our justice system. If Daniel's story of courage and redemption moved you, please hit that like button to help us reach more people who need to hear about heroes like him. Subscribe and ring the notification bell, because we're committed to bringing you more untold stories of American veterans who deserve recognition and respect. Share this video with friends and family who believe in justice and equal treatment under the law. Your shares help ensure that stories like Daniel's reach the audience they deserve, and that the sacrifices of our veterans are never forgotten or dishonored. Thank you for watching and for caring about justice for all Americans, regardless of their race or background. Remember that in a democracy, we are all responsible for holding our institutions accountable and protecting the innocent from those who would abuse their power. Stay strong, keep fighting for what's right, and never forget that truth and justice will ultimately prevail when good people refuse to stay silent.